Welcome back to the class. We are continuing our discussion on Saskia Sassen. And in the previous class, we had a look at a summary of Saskin's basic arguments in her work, The Global City, as given in Andrew Jones' work, Globalization Key Thinkers. So, as I mentioned in the previous class, it's a summary by Andrew Jones so that you get an idea about her overall arguments, because this work global cities in multiple editions, and then she has reframed and revised her arguments substantially. So we decided to look at the summary so that you get a clarity on that. And in today's class, we will go ahead with her own original article titled "The Global City: Localizations of the Global" by Saskia Sassen. It's a lecture offered there, and localizations of global. Yeah, so this is the details. It's this essay is available in the in JSTOR or other sites, so that you can read the original essay. So this is how it appears. So let us. It's not a very lengthy one. I think it's 6 or 7 pages. So let us look at this essay more closely. So the city localization of the global. Now, over the centuries, the cities have been at the intersections of processes with supra-urban and even interconnected scales. What is different today is the intensity, complexity, and global span of these networks, and the extent to which significant portions of economies are now dematerialized and digitized, and hence can travel at great speeds through these networks where before they existed in fixed place. And I don't think that we require any more elaboration on that, because we mentioned in the previous class that she's talking about informationalism. She's talking about the emergence of service sector as a major drive for economic activity. If earlier the manufacture was the central driving force of economy, it's no longer the case. What we are seeing is a kind of, it's a dematerialized and digitized. All our services are can be brought under this situation, whether it's software or advertisement or accounting or tourism or anything of that sort comes under that. So as cities and urban regions are increasingly traversed by non-local circuits, okay, how much of what we experience as the local is also global, because the local is actually a transformed condition, a localization of global processes. So I hope you remember our discussion on this term global and local in the arguments of Arjuna Padure, and even the terms like Robertson used the term glocalization. Okay, so what we understand as local is no longer disconnected from the global. Okay, so the local is only a manifestation of the global in a different sense. So one way of thinking about them is terms of urban processes and entities in the cities. And since Sassen is a urban sociologist, she gives example from urban centers, whereas Padure gives you examples from a host of other cultural repertoire. So the new urban specialities thus produced its is partial in the double sense. It accounts for only part of what happens in the cities and what cities is about, and it inhabits only part of what we might think as the space of the city. Whether this is be understood in terms of as a diverse or those of a city's administrative bound. Yeah. So now the whole question is, what is an urban place in this context? So she is basically asking this question: how do we make sense of an urban space in the context of a globalization? Okay, because our conventional understanding of an urban space in the traditional sense is that you define a space as urban space on the basis of the population density. That is why you had this distinction between the urban and the rural. And of course, later you distinguish it on the basis of economic activity. In the rural areas, it will be mostly agrarian-based activities, whereas here it will be industry-based. But these conventional traditional arguments are losing its significance, because the population density no longer defines whether a particular city is an urban space. So now she brings in this idea of cited materialities and global span. Cited materialities and global span. So I want to address the question of place in today's cities through the lens of digital global economy. So we mentioned in the previous class again that Susskind is a sociologist who really emphasizes on the emphasizes on the centrality of place. Okay, she is somebody who is very strongly, very vehemently argues to consider, to take into account the still continuing importance of the physical aspect or the spatial aspect or the geographical aspect of that. Of course, the discussion has gone much beyond that. So it seems to me that the difficulty analysts and commentators have had specifying understanding the impact of digitization on cities, indeed on multiple configurations, essentially results from two analytical flows. One of these, especially evident in US, confines to interpretation of a technological reading of the technical capabilities of digital economy. This is fine for engineers, but for reading such reading becomes problematic when we want to understand how these technologies interact with social conditions, notably place. A purely technological reading of a technical capabilities of digital technology inevitably leads one to place that is a known place where we can announce with certainty the neutralizing of many of these configurations marked by physicality and place boundedness, such as urban. So the first issue is if you look only at the kind of a technological implications of a technology, then without looking into the other social or cultural aspects, then you don't get a kind of an important insight into that. The second flow, she argues, is the continuing reliance on an analytical category that were developed under the spatial. So for example, she talks about how to look at digital is only as digital and non-digital only as non-digital, okay, without really understanding the kind of a correspondence between these two things. For example, in the previous scheme of things, you will not really try to understand how, for example, your identity or subjectivity is being transformed through the platform of digitization. So, but in the contemporary times, such arguments are extremely important. Now, an alternative categorization would capture. So now she puts forward her argument that how to make sense of the city in the context of globalization is would capture the implications between the digital and the non-digital. Let me illustrate this using the case of finance. So finance is certainly a highly digitized activity, yet it cannot be thought of as exclusively digital, because you to a large extent you require the financial aspect to have a kind of a material effect, because when a company decides to construct its headquarter or to buy a real estate property or buy equipments, you see that this finance actually gets a kind of a concrete form. So finance, while we say that everything is online transaction and with a click you will be able to control the flow of money which runs into billions of dollars or euros, but still it has this kind of a material aspect. So obviously much of what takes place in cyberspace is deeply inflected by cultures, material practices, the imaginaries that take place outside cyberspace. So basically she's being a social scientist, she's arguing, or she's very strongly urging you to look at the kind of an influence and the kind of a reciprocity. That is why she's using the term imbrications, the kind of a mutual influence between the digital and the non-digital world. The complex imbrications between digital as well as the global and the non-digital brings with the destabilizing of the older hierarchies of scale and often dramatic rescaling. Okay, so your understanding about your conventional understanding of scales. You have you have the locality, then you have the regional, then you have sub-regional at the lower level, then you have the national one, then you have the international. So these kind of a conventional scales of geographies are now significantly altered or significantly disturbed. With the loss of key components of the national state's formal authority over the national scale, other scales gain strategic importance. And this is again a point that we discussed, to what extent nation states have the kind of a conventional authority over its territory. Okay, we discussed it several times, and we are also going to discuss it when we bring up a discussion by Ulrich Beck. The kind of a conventional authority that nation state had exerted on its geography, on its soil, is significantly altered. We have free economic zones, we have the boundaries are porous, and you want more and more foreign investment to come and invest in your place. Your legal system has been tweaked, your policies have been tweaked significantly. So that whole idea is significantly changed. So most especially among these are sub-national scales such as the global city, the supranational scales such as global markets and regional trading zones. So this she's talking about the necessity to have a completely new imagination about the scales. Today's rescalings cut across institutional size and through policies such as deregulation, privatization, cut across the institutional encasements of territory produced by formation of national states. This does not mean that the old hierarchies disappear, but rather that rescaling emerges alongside old ones, and that they can often trump the latter. So I hope you remember the very first lecture on this chapter on speciality, we discussed Swapna Guha Banerjee's argument about how this the kind of a connection between global capital and geography, it raises quite a lot of very important questions about the role of the state government and how new specialities become important. Now, these transformations which continue to entail complex implications of the digital and non-digital between the global and the non-global can be captured in a variety of instances. For example, much of what we might still experience as the local, an official office building or a house or an institution right there in our neighborhood or downtown, actually something I would rather think as a micro environment with global span. It's a very important maybe term that you need to keep it in mind. It's a micro environment with a global span. You can think of an education institution, you can think of a restaurant, you can think of a shop. Now this shop could be a local shop in your immediate neighborhood, but this shop also is representative, or is also is a site through which the global flows actually take place. Yeah, it is a sited materiality. Okay, so such a micro environment is in many sense localized entity, something that can be experienced as a local, immediate, proximate, and hence captured topographic representation. It's a sited materiality. Okay, but it is also a part of a global digital networks, which gives immediate far-flung span. And to continue to think of this as simply local is neither useful nor adequate. So I think we know that a shop in front of you, a shop in your neighborhood, a boutique in your neighborhood, or a showroom that sells you a lot of new electronic gadgets. These are all part of both the sited materiality as well as the digitized world. A second example is the bundle of conditions and dynamics that marks the model of global city. Just to single out one key dynamic, the more globalized and digitized operations of firms and markets, the more their central management and coordination functions and the requisite material structures becoming strategic. This is exactly something that we discussed in the previous class when she revised her argument in the second edition of her book, The Global City. It is precisely because of digitization that simultaneous worldwide dispersal of operations whether factories, offices or service outlets, and systems integration can be achieved. And this is precisely this combination which raises the importance of central functions. Global cities are strategic sites for the combination of resources necessary for the production of these central functions. We discussed that, how many of these companies or firms are now, have this Herculean task of coordinating the central functions, and which many of them they outsource. So this global city becomes the material site in which these processes actually take place. Now, much of what is liquefied and circulated in digital network and is marked by hypermobility remain physical in some of its components. Take for example real estate. I think you can easily understand that the real estate is about physicality. It is about land. It is about physical structures. It is about how these physical structures are important. Yet part of what constitutes real estate remains very physical, while quite a lot of other things are about investment, money and legal title and other things. Now, we have difficulty capturing this multivalence through our conventional categories. Okay, if it is physical, it is physical, and if it is digital, it is digital. So she says that this conventional approach of looking at these two things as watertight compartments, or looking at these two things as binaries, that the physical and digital are completely different, that perspective or that framework no longer works. That is her emphatic point. In fact, the partial representation of real estate through liquid financial instruments produce a complex implication of the material and the dematerialized moments in which we continue to call real estate. Now, hypermobility and dematerialization are usually seen as mere functions of the new technologies. This understanding erases the fact that it takes multiple material conditions to achieve this outcome, and it takes social networks, not only digital ones. So once we recognize that hypermobility of an instrument, or the dematerialization of the actual piece of real estate had to be produced, we introduce the implication of the material and the non-material. It takes capital fixity to produce capital mobility, that is to say, state-of-the-art built environment, conventional infrastructure from the highways to the airports and railways, and well-housed talent. These are all at least partly placed around place-bound conditions, even though the nature of their place-boundedness is going to be different from what it was 100 years ago. So again, the same argument that the physicality of that, even when you talk about networks, you talk about spaces of flows, you talk about financial transactions in digitized form, but at the end, they need to adopt certain kind of a material character. So they have to be conventional infrastructure should be there, highways should be there, office spaces must be there, meeting places must be there, high-end living spaces must be there, entertainment facilities there. So these material conditions are important. Today, it is a place-boundedness that is inscribed by the hypermobility of some of its components of produced outcomes. So she is repeatedly asking you to look at the kind of an implication between the digital and the non-digital. Now, the specialities of the center, another section. Information technologies have not eliminated the importance of massive concentrations of material resources, but have rather reconfigured the interaction of capital fixity and hypermobility. Okay? The complex management of this interaction has given some clarity, some cities new competitive advantage. So the very peculiar connection between capital fixity and hypermobility, how that this particular combination has given rise to novel forms of economic activities and novel forms of relevance to the very idea of city. That's what she is looking at. The vast new economic topography that is being implemented through electronic space is one moment, one fragment of an even vast economic chain that is in good part embedded in non-electronic spaces. There is today no fully virtualized firm or economic sector. Obviously, even when we say that everything is virtual, but still you simply do not run anything Completely virtually, absolutely virtually, because you require human beings are real people, and real people require real spaces to occupy. So that argument has to be tempered. Even finance, the most digitized, dematerialized and globalized of all activities, has a topography that weaves back and forth between the actual and digital space. The different extent in different types of sectors and different types of firms, a firm's tasks now are distributed across these two kinds of spaces. Okay, the combination of the new capabilities of mobility along with patterns of concentration and operational features of the cutting edge sectors of advanced economy suggest that the spatial concentration remains a key feature of these sectors. But it is not simply a continuation of older patterns of spatial concentration. So this is the key point, that even while the spatial concentration remains important, why that a city like London or Tokyo or Hong Kong or Mumbai is important, it's not because that traditionally they have been important, but also because, or more importantly, they have been able to successfully integrate into the new global processes. Today, there is no longer a simple, straightforward relation between centrality and such geographic entities such as downtown or the central business district. Okay, what she calls it as CBD. In the past and up to quite recently, in fact, centrality was synonymous with the downtown or the CBD. So, new technologies and organizational forms have altered the spatial correlates of centralities. Every huge cities, you have this central business district where all the important firms are located. So, thus the center can be the CBD, as is still in largely for some of the leading sectors, notably finance, or an alternative form of CBD such as Silicon Valley. Yet, even as the CBD in major international business centers remain a strategic site for the leading industries, it is only profoundly reconfigured by the technological and economic change. Further, there are often sharp differences in the patterns assumed by this reconfiguration of the central city in different parts of the world. Second, the center can extend to the metropolitan area in a form of a grid of nodes of intense business activity. One might ask whether a spatial organization characterized by dense strategic nodes spread over a broader regions does in fact constitute the new forms of organizing the territory of the center, rather than, as in the more conventional view, an instance of suburbanization or geographic dispersal. Insofar as these various nodes are articulated through digital networks, they represent the new geographic correlates of the most advanced type of the center. This is partially deterritorialized space of centrality. So, she's asking us to look at the new relevance of this central, the whole idea of center or the central business district as it has been usually understood, and what is its relevance with respect to the rest of the city and the rest of the world. Okay, so they retain its relevance with respect to the rest of the city, but also more importantly, these central business districts are also becoming more and important with respect to the larger global economic processes as well. Third, we are seeing the formation of trans-territorial center constitutes via intense economic transactions of the network of global cities. These transactions take place partially in digital space and partially through conventional transport and travel. The result is a multiplication of often highly specialized circuits connecting sets of cities. So, we know that different cities, as we mentioned in the previous class, different cities are connected. They are, Sasson herself argues that they need to be seen as network urban areas, urban centers, urban spaces, rather than looking at them as individual cities. Yeah, so she elaborates that. So, what does contextuality mean in this setting? These networked sub-economies operating partly in actual space and partly in global spanning digital space cannot easily be contextualized in terms of their surroundings. So, what do we mean by context in this whole thing? Because usually you talk about context in the conventional sense as its immediate geographic, historical, socio-political surroundings. You try to situate a place in the conventional social sense. Now this contextualization, which was part of our social science training, is now requires a completely different type of skills, completely different kind of imagination. How do you contextualize it? Because for example, a you know a religious institution. A religious institution, you usually try to understand, you try to contextualize that particular institution, looking into the history, looking into the economy, looking into the social profile of the people who attend to that. So that's how you make sense of that particular religious institution. But now that is no longer the case. Okay, so the context of a particular religious institution, you will not understand its complete sense only by looking its immediate context, because that could be a part of a transnational religious group which is emerged somewhere else, and this could be just a part of that. This could be just a branch of that. Okay, so you see that the context assumes completely different meaning when you talk about globalization. Okay, so the network sub-economies operating partly in actual spaces and partly in global spanning digital spaces cannot easily be contextualized in terms of their surroundings, nor can the individual firms and markets. The orientation of this type of sub-economies is simultaneously towards itself and towards the global. The intensity of internal transactions in such sub-economy, she's talking about that. On another larger scale, in my research on global cities, I found rather clearly that these sub-economies develop a stronger orientation towards the global market than to their hinterlands. Thereby, they override a key proposition in the urban system literature, to wit that cities and urban systems integrate and particulate national territory. A very, very important point, because to what extent a particular part of the urban city is integrated to the rest of the country. Or is it more integrated to the rest of the country, or is it more integrated to places outside the nation state? Okay, so it again goes against the conventional wisdom, where you understand the rural and urban as a part of a continuum, and it all constituting to a larger national geography, national economy, national imagination, and that sense of integration is being called into question. Okay, so this may have been the case during the period when mass manufacturing and mass consumption were the dominant growth machines in developed economies and thrived in national economies. Today, the ascendance of a digitized, globalized, dematerialized sector such as finance has diluted that articulation with the larger national economic and immediate hinterland. So many of these the cities or part of the cities have very little to do to the hinterlands of that particular society, but we may have much stronger connections with the larger the world outside. So what then is the context, the local here? The new networked sub-economy occupies a strategic geography, partly deterritorialized, that cuts across borders and connects a variety of points on the globe. Okay, so it's no longer contained within the boundaries of the nation state. It occupies only a fraction of its local setting. Its boundaries are not those of the city where it is partially located, nor those of the neighborhood. This sub-economy interferes in the intensity of the vast concentrations of every material resources it needs when it hits the ground, and the fact of its global span or global cross-border geography. Its interlocutor is not the surrounding, the context, but the fact of the global. Okay, so so to what extent a particular local is conversing or interacting or transacting with its immediate context or its immediate neighbors is a very, very problematic question, because many times if we have much thicker, much stronger connections with the globe, with the global networks outside. I'm not sure what this tearing away of the context and its replacement with the fact of the global could mean for the urban practices and theory. The strategic operation is not the search for a connection with the surroundings in the context. It is rather installation in a strategic cross-border geography constituting through the multiple locals. So, these multiple locals, you are dealing with these locals in completely different sense, because your local or your immediate context does not give you any assured set of ideas, okay, unlike what we premised in the previous times. In case of the economy, I see a rescaling. Old hierarchies, that is local, regional, national, global, do not hold. Yeah, so that's what. So to going to the next scale in terms of the size is no longer how integration is achieved. The local now transacts directly with the global, and the global instills itself in the local, and the global is itself constituted through a multiplicity of local situations. I think you maybe need to underline this particular section and then read it more carefully. The local now transacts directly with the global instills itself in the local, and the global is itself constituted through the multiplicity of local situations. So we the whole taken for granted ideas about what is local and what is global is completely disturbed. It's completely disoriented. The global without the local, you simply do not have a global, because a global is a maybe you can say that it's a as she says, it's a multiplicity of local situations, and the local you cannot have a local which is disconnected from the global. Okay, so that you can see it in anything. You can see it in consumption, you can see it in identities. For example, you look at how an idea like feminism, an educated woman's idea about her own freedom, her own right over her own body, her own right over her own sexuality, her own reproduction. Okay, these ideas are not simply that person gets only from her own surrounding. It's a part of a much larger discourse, or even religiosity for that matter, or new ideas. Okay, so nothing is coming and getting contained only within a limited geographic area. So that's why I keep repeatedly saying that globalization is happening through us. We are a party to that. We are not merely witnessing globalization, but we are actively facilitating globalization. We are party to that. We are a part of that. We contribute equally into that, because even when we say that we are saying something about local, we are looking at the whole idea of local is changed, whether starting from the material conditions, starting from the consumption pattern, starting from the kind of ideas that we subscribe to, starting from the idea of your own identity, who you are, okay, what kind of possibilities that you have, what kind of options that you have, what kind of possibilities for your individual experiences. All these things are no longer disconnected from the global discourses. So she also gives a kind of a conclusion, which is a overall argument. So for example, she says this calls for the urbanist able to navigate multiple forms of knowledge and introduce the possibility of an architectural practice located in space, such as intersections of multiple transport and communication network, where the naked eye of the engineer's imagination sees no shape, no possibility. Yeah, read that, because the central argument is the need to go beyond these binaries of digital and physical, and the argument about that a global city, and especially the part of that global city, is assuming its very different functions. Okay, cities have been so important, so prominent from the time being, but the role played by the cities, or things that defined the salience or importance of the cities, are undergoing significant transformations, and they are becoming relevant. Again, not the whole city, but part of that city is redefining itself, because they are increasingly becoming a part of a larger global network. So this is the major argument of Saskia Sassen. Now let us stop here, and we will start with Manuel Castells from tomorrow onwards. Okay, so see you then. Thank you.